Hello, dear guests, dear Soraya, Klaus, Fred, and Ulrich. I would like to warmly welcome you to the garden of the Thomas Mann House today. Thank you all for coming to Pacific Palisades on this beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon. I'm very much delighted about and grateful for our fantastic group of panelists discussing such a timely topic today. Machines of Mistrust, the Fabric of Digital Cultures is the title of today's program, which will be looking into our relationship with media and technology. When the Mann family lived here in this house from 1942 to 1952, media played a key role in their everyday lives. The family regularly gathered around their Victrola gramophone, listening to shellac records from Wagner, Britten, and Beethoven. On Sundays, Mann often tuned in to listen to concerts from the Hollywood Bowl via live radio broadcasts. He developed a deep and lasting fascination for the gramophone, noting in his diary that this technological device was a mentally and purely epic find. Already in the 1920s, Mann acquired his own gramophone and dedicated a whole chapter in his novel The Magic Mountain to electric gramophone music. In Los Angeles, Thomas and Katja also went to see movies in theaters in Westwood, Hollywood, or Santa Monica, sometimes even twice a week. In his diaries, we can find over 50 entries noting he was going to Westwood to the movies, followed by a short, poignant note about the film he saw that night. In April 1944, Mann went to see a film called Lady in the Dark at the Fox Theater in Westwood. He noted after the film, "A psychoanalytic dream show, not a very pleasing film, but very interesting use of a color technique in respect to a potential Joseph film." Mann, the film fan, was at this point still dreaming about a filmic version of his Joseph novels. Seeing the creative use of the relatively new Technicolor in Lady in the Dark made him reflect on the medium of film itself and imaginatively construct and test out the film that was never made. Which type of color technology would actually convey his Joseph saga best? When we look at technology and media, we tend to primarily pay attention to the content. We talk about a movie, its plot, and the performance of an actor. We discuss the political implications of a novel, or we reiterate the arguments of a Twitter discussion. We tend to talk about and around content. The container for this content, or the technology that enables it, can be overlooked in the process. In his text, Becoming Media, Galileo's Telescope, the German media studies scholar Josef Vogel writes that media makes things readable, audible, visible, and perceptible, but in doing so, they also have a tendency to erase themselves. Marshall McLuhan's well-known dictum, "The medium is the message," reminds us once again that sometimes it is important to take a step back and look at the framework in and through which we engage with media, and to question some of our own assumptions. When did we actually start thinking of the computer as a standardized, always reliable machine that can help us seamlessly excavate knowledge and information? Why and since when do we instinctively trust photography as a supposedly objective form of recording reality, when in fact the history of photography is deeply rooted in esoteric ideas of recording things that precisely can't be seen, such as ghosts and spirits? And since today's possibility of photographic post-production, we more and more question its assurance to accurately represent reality. These are just examples to show common ideas of trust in technology and science have been constructed differently over the centuries and within different cultural contexts. And these ideas have been communicated through ever-changing constellations of different media. From personal witnessing to peer-reviewed journal articles to Twitter's newsfeed. Can we, from today's perspective, potentially draw conclusions for the future by looking at our own historical relationship to technology? How did the very technologies which many thought would enhance our faith in one another in fact came to corrode it? Especially today, when our media environment can give rise to facts and lies that seem more difficult to distinguish from one another. As algorithms take on an increasingly important role in what we believe to know and perceive, it is urgent to critically and perhaps also creatively reflect on our relationship with these media ecospheres. I'm truly delighted to listen to our guests today, as each of them brings their own remarkable perspective from their respective field to the table. Let me start with Soraya de Chadarevian. She is professor in the Department of History and the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. And she is interested in the material and visual practices in the life sciences and the place of these sciences in broader culture. She has worked extensively on the history of molecular biology and the complex scientific, institutional, political, and cultural processes that contributed to the development of this new science. Her most recent monograph, Heredity Under the Microscope, Chromosomes and the Study of the Human Genome, is a study of post-war history of human heredity told from the vantage point of chromosomes. Thank you, Soraya, for joining us today. Fred Turner is professor of communication at Stanford University, and he is the author of several prominent books related to today's topics, such as Seeing Silicon Valley, Life Inside a Fraying America with Mary Beth Meehan, The Democratic Surround, Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s, and From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stuart Brown, The Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism. In his work, he explores media, technology, and American cultural history. He's especially interested in how emerging media have shaped American life since World War II. Thank you for making the trip down the coast, Fred, and for joining us today. During his time at the Thomas Mann House, Claus Pias explores the beginning of narratives around the digital age and its historiographical, economic, scientific, and ideological purposes. Claus is professor of history and epistemology of media at the Leuphana Universität in Lüneburg, where his research focuses on the history of media in science, technology, and art. And we're very happy that since April, Claus has been a fellow at the Thomas Mann House. After three brief presentations by our guests providing insights into our ever-changing relationship with technology and the discourses that surround it, our fellow Ulrich Schneider will moderate today's discussion. Thank you, Ulrich. Ulrich is a historian of knowledge, and since 2006 he has been the director of the Leipzig University Library. He is currently working on a multi-year project of a global history of the modern library. After the discussion, there will be time for questions from the audience as well. And please feel free to join us after the event for a little reception with drinks and snacks here in the garden, and we can perhaps continue the conversation. And finally, before I hand over to our guests, I would like to thank my dear colleagues, Emilienne Lacco, Julia Welter, Katrin Klüppel, Alicia Nicodemus, and Betty Ramirez for their help organizing and planning this event. And I'm very excited to also see some familiar faces from our colleagues at the Villa Aurora, Claudia Gordon and Friedel Schmoranzer. And I would also like to welcome the newly arrived Villa Aurora stipends who are also with us today. Please welcome together with me Soraya, Claus, Fred, and Ulrich.
Trust in politics and the media has always been a problem. But what about science? So science, we like to think, is built on rigorous observations and experimentations, and therefore produces reproducible, trustworthy knowledge. Facts. Scientific facts can be checked, and that is exactly what distinguishes them from other kinds of statements. So if we follow the philosopher Karl Popper, it's precisely the fact that scientific statements are continuously put to the test and can be falsified that distinguishes science from pseudoscience or other belief systems like political belief systems or religion. So, and with American sociologist Robert Merton, Popper also, and others, Popper also believed that the critical spirit, or what he called critical rationalism, that characterizes science, can only flourish in an open democratic society, and also vice versa, that trustworthy knowledge produced by science is a pillar of knowledge-based, advanced democratic societies. Now, some of these convictions have been contested. For instance, historians have shown that science can very well flourish in fascist systems, and even more that techno-scientific projects have functions as a pillar of fascist regimes. But nevertheless, if we can figure out the relation between knowledge, trust, democracy, and the media of communication for science, which supposedly is this bulwark of reliable knowledge, perhaps it can provide us some clues on how to think about these relationships in other social domains where mistrust has more obviously become a problem. And of course, this is a high call, and I can only maybe raise just a few questions here. Now, as a matter of fact, trust in science has held up okay in respect to other domains in this recent crisis of legitimation. So a study on the public perception of science in America conducted by the American Academy of Arts and Science that came out in 2018, I have it here. This is 2018, if you remember, it's in the middle of the Trump administration's assault on scientific credibility. Indicated that confidence in science in American public was stable or also growing a little through the 1910s, while, for instance, the trust in banks, the press, and Congress, and today we would probably add the Supreme Court, have been declining. It grew so the trust in science grew at the beginning of the pandemic, but then started falling and is now below what it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Thus, also trust has held up. There is never, trust in science has held up. There is nevertheless the perception of a crisis that goes together with the perception of a crisis of democracy in the US and more generally. Now, before we look a little closer into the reasons for this current corrosion of public trust in science, it will be useful to have a short look at the history. And so what we find is that scientists have always been concerned about questions of trust, so that's not something new, and they have put in place various systems, which I call here the technologies of trust, to guarantee that science is trustworthy and is perceived as such. Now, this could rest on the persona of the scientist, his or her moral values, or in the way science was conducted and transmitted. And so these criteria also, what produced trustworthy knowledge, as well as the criteria for what was regarded as objective knowledge, changed over time, as historians have shown. Now, just to give you a little sort of hint at what these technologies of trust consisted in. So, for instance, the early modern philosophers and naturalists had to be financially independent to be trustworthy. That is, they did not receive any money for their scientific work. They were self-funded. And that was seen to guarantee their independence and trustworthiness. They were also known as gentlemen scientists, and men they mostly were, even if there were some prominent women among them. And so that was a shared idea well into the 19th century. And of course, it's a very elitist idea, right? Only who has money can do science and be trustworthy. Now, in addition, natural philosophers in the Royal Society in London, 17th century, which is often seen as the cradle of Western science, developed an intricate system of virtual witnessing for readers to trust their results. And so virtual witnessing would be one of these technologies of trust. So this is, the scientific reports were written in such a way that they allowed the readers to virtually witness the actual experiments and thus imbue trust in the results. And the reports were also accompanied by illustrations of the experimental setup to support this effort. And so the scientists themselves then were represented as detached observers of the facts that they were looking at, and so that they would just report about them as these detached observers. And so this was a particular form in how to tell these experiments and the results. So this went on for quite a while, but as government and private funding for science increased in the post-World War II era, and scientists started to be paid for their work, new systems to guarantee the quality and trustworthiness of science were put in place. And here, one system I want to talk about is the peer review, which is this new technology of trust. Another one would be conflict of interest statements, which came, to clarify connections to commercial funding and so on. but there will be no time to speak about that. So a little bit about the peer review. This is the evaluation of written work pre-publication by one or more experts in the field. It gained importance at a moment that saw a dramatic expansion of the scientific enterprise, and also the journal article when the journal article became the preferred medium for scientific communication. Now, while originally it was mostly the journal editor deciding if something was worth publishing or not, the sheer volume of submissions and also the increasing specialization of science made it increasingly difficult for one person to do all this work, apart of the fact that the one-person decision could be perceived as biased. And often it was. So the peer review system was designed to do different things, and also that changed over time. So on the one hand, it was to guarantee the quality of submissions and thus keep the trust in science alive. But it was also to negotiate the shifting relationship between the scientist and the funding sources, which could be government or industrialist or private money. So the peer review kept the evaluation of scientific work in the hands of the scientists, rather than opening up science to congressional or other kinds of oversight. So it's scientists and not politicians, science administrator, or for that matter, commercial or private funders who decide if a project is worth funding and if the results are trustworthy and deserve to be published. Now, peer-reviewed journal articles are still the gold standard, right? So that's what counts, right? Peer-reviewed. But nonetheless, the peer review system has actually many critics. Many scientists think it is opaque and biased and stifles progress by creating barriers to publication. And its effectiveness in rewarding good science and correcting bad science has also been called into questions. Now, there are all kinds of examples that show that articles that did not make it or hardly made it through a peer review later turned out to be very important. And then other way around, that fraudulent science, like ghostwritten articles, also sometimes make it, or quite regularly make it, through the peer review system. So a former editor of the British Medical Journal, an important journal in the medical field, issued what I think is the most devastating critique of the peer review process. So he claimed that it was ineffective, largely a lottery, anti-innovatory, slow, expensive, wasteful of scientific time, inefficient, easily abused, prone to bias, unable to detect fraud, and therefore irrelevant. That's, quite a bad critique. Another interesting point is that, as others have pointed out, that the credibility conferred by the peer-reviewed label, right, that this is good, trustworthy knowledge, could diminish this culture of doubt that is necessary for science to operate a self-correcting, truth-seeking process, right? Because sort of it stifles thinking critically because you just rely on it, right? Like science always needs this critical spirit, as we have heard before. So this seems to be indicating that we are at the brink of a change here of these systems. Now, what should the new system look like? Now, critics have argued that rather than trying to reform the peer review system, which is beyond reform, according to some, they should ditch this completely and instead allow researchers to simply post the papers online for feedback from the broader scientific community. And this is maybe something like the Wikipedia model of publishing. And we can talk maybe, now if digital technologies can really help to elevate, or if they will exasperate the trust problem, is a topic I think my co-panelist can better address. And I think I stop here. I have a few more things to say, but we can see. I think it's a good moment to stop because here are the two media specialists that can come in.
So we add the two other talks and then have a discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much for your patience. Ulrich will kill me if it gets too long, so I try to keep things short. So my professional deformation is media studies, which means that I don't look at content, but more at technical media, which is a very German-ish way to look at technology apart from sociology and political studies and so. And I'm going to talk about history of technology, especially computer technology, not at least because many sciences are today, or since 70 years, dependent on or implemented via computer technology. These are the technologies that the sciences use. And I will try to link the question of trust in digital technologies to the question of reproduction in science. So to this end, I understand trust as a kind of legitimate expectation with regard to reproduction. So what I define as a technical object is something that is reliable and predictable. So from a car, you expect that it starts if you turn the key or press the button. So if this expectation is confirmed several times, trust increases. But if your car always starts, you trust car building technologies because it reproduces behavior. So in this sense, trust is related to experience and expectation. So experience and expectation, on the other hand, are also fundamental historical concepts. The German historian Reinhard Koselleck coined the term space of experience and horizon of expectation to describe a specifically modern concept of temporality emerging around 1800, in which the future becomes open and unpredictable, but yet dependent on experience. So this is a temporality in which technical objects don't live. The technical object, like a car, lives more in a kind of eternal recurrence, in a temporality without horizon, or let's say has a closed future in which experience and expectations always ideally match. So the interesting question would then be, and this is my first question, what kind of object do we mean when we speak of computers? So we very much used to think of computers as technical objects. Yeah? You press print and you expect the computer to print something. You type in something into Word and you don't expect your word processor to be creative. Even crashes, application crashing or something doesn't work. Trust only become temporarily destabilized because troubleshooting itself starts with the concept of reproduction. You try to reproduce the error. So it's in what Alexandre Corre called a super paradigm. Reproduction is the super paradigm of technology, apart from which technology you're thinking of. So errors are always already included as an exception of reproduction into the reproductive discourse. So, but, and this is my second point, the idea of the computer being a technical object is only the result of a particular historical process. It took several decades, actors, practices, contexts, and imaginaries to build this idea, and this would be, in the end, my third question, an idea of the computer as a technical object that is beginning to dissolve over the past 20 years, 15 years, perhaps. So here comes, as a second part, a short history. Until Second World War, so-called analog computers were more or less reliable technical objects. However, with the advent of electronic digital devices in the 1940s, the computer once again became what Hans-Jörg Reinberg always called an epistemic thing, meaning that it was in the 40s open and unresolved what kind of object these machines would be in the future. And especially the question of reproduction was controversial. So in cybernetics, which was the discourse of the time in the 40s and 50s, digital computers have been addressed as a fundamentally new kind of machine that doesn't belong to the realm of technical objects. So these new machines were called the transclassical machines, non-trivial machines, or meta-technologies by, and it's just European quotes, this is Heinz von Förster, Gotthard Günther, and Max Bense. So such claims drew primarily on unpredictable, emergent, and adaptive machine behavior. This was largely addressed via comparisons with human brain. So plasticity and the ability to learn categorically distinguished these new machines from the existing machine world from a cybernetic point of view. So, but if the new machines are capable of learning, they exist in a different temporality as technical objects do. Because if they learn, because what they do next depends on their individual history and experience. This is what Norbert Wiener, one of the fathers of cybernetics in the late 40s, called the difference between Newtonian and Bergsonian time. And these new machines, this was Wiener's idea, live in the Bergsonian time. So in a way, they have a kind of open future. So the fundamental question was of how one wants to deal with machines of which one does not exactly know how they will behave in the future. So on the one hand, in the 40s, there were the epistemological expectations of unexpected, emergent, non-trivial behavior, completely new machines. And on the other hand, there were technical expectations directed toward reproducible, reliable, trivial, technical behavior of these machines. These were the demands of the industry, business, research, and the military, or in short, the military-industrial complex. So when computer became industrial products in the 50s, the epistemological expectations, they vanished or they found niches like AI, genetical algorithms, chaos theory, etc. over several years. But the mainstream was about various coping strategies like standardization, higher programming language, scaling, operating systems, separation of hardware and software, and so to tame the computer in order to become a technical object. And I skip some parts here. In order to exclude possible irritating, unexpected behavior, for example, this is just one of the many strategies of securing trust in computers. The term transparency was coined in computer science in the early 1970s with semantics, which is completely opposed to the humanities' understanding of transparency. Because in a computer science semantics, any entity that can remain opaque is considered transparent. Yeah? So precisely because and as long this entity fulfills certain expectations of reproducible behavior. Yeah? They are entities that can be blindly trusted. That's why they're called black boxes. You don't have to open it, you trust it. The same input results in the same output. They're deterministic things, and the idea was that you can scale trust. If you build up machines and software via intransparent, opaque, and therefore transparent units, you receive a trustworthy overall system, which is deterministic. And the last episode might be the personal computer, which also had a huge impact on the understanding of computer, because at that time, the computer became a consumer product. So people now buy a guaranteed scope of functions from a manufacturer. Yeah? So since then, illiterate customers have a legitimate claim and right. They can sue the seller. A right that the product works as promised, similar to turning a key in a car. So PC as a commodity in all its ubiquity finally, I think, stabilized the cultural coding of the computer as a technical object. So third part, and then I come to an end about the same thing. Why I'm telling all this? Let me come back to my first point, that over the past 70 years, countless sciences have implicitly or explicitly become computer sciences because of their massive usage of computer technology. And entirely new branches of research have emerged. New research subjects have been opened that would have been unresearchable without the medium of the computer. Think of crash tests or things like that, or climate research, or there's a multitude of that. So my simple assertion is that the medium has an influence on the understanding of science and scientificness. In other words, a medium that is assumed to reproduce behavior more precisely and reliably than any other medium increases expectations of reproducibility. With this, the computer answers to a very old idea, and you can relate to the things you said. Early modern sciences already were based on the idea of reproducibility, but for a long time, they depended on more, let's say, situated implementations of instruments, procedures, local scales, and so on, that formed the basis for a more loosely defined kind of replicability. And then later 19th century, reproducibility was considerably simplified by standardization of scales. Think of the Urmeter, the initial meter of the French Revolution, and the standardization and industrial production of measuring instruments that could be interchanged between laboratories. So this increased expectations of reproducibility and strengthened the notion of objectivity. On a final stage, with computers, the problem of reproducibility seemed to simplify considerably. For computer experiments and simulations are above all symbolic processes. Yeah. So finally, it seemed possible to liberate experimenting from its problematic materiality and move it in a symbolic space of code and execution. So, and by reducing computers to deterministic machines, simulations appeared as almost ideal experiments because the symbolic virtual space in which they take place is completely controllable and reproducible without any loss. So the provocative idea might be that the greater the belief in perfect reproducibility by digital media becomes, the greater the tendency also becomes to define the quality of science in general by the degree of its reproducibility. Yeah? And I think it's a symptom that such breathtaking expectations of digital media set the stage for what then was called the reproduction crisis in the early 2000s, which started in medicine, then swapped over to psychology, and then a lot of other disciplines that were very much based on computing. No one denies, and this is a footnote, no one denies that this also involves fraud and imposture. And it's also about science critics who use the argument of non-reproducibility to justify all kinds of nonsense. This is true. But the reverse is also true. A science policy that believes what is reproducible is therefore already trustworthy and good science is likewise naive. So my objection to this, and now I can really come to the end, is that the very notion of computers as technical objects, as completely intelligible, controllable, deterministic, and reproducible virtual spaces, this idea of computers is relatively young, and it may prove a particular episode in history, giving way to a completely different understanding of what computing is. And this, I think, can be observed more and more frequently, that intelligibility and reproducibility of computational methods are no longer given, that you cannot repeat or reproduce virtual experiments. And this has nothing to do with the sloppiness of researchers, and it has nothing to do with fraud, and it has nothing to do with errors in the machines or in the software, But for example, with compiler, with adaptive methods, with parallelization of high-performance computing, and especially with machine learning. So I think there's a need to revise perhaps our understanding of the medium of computing, and this also meaning the medium of science with regard to trust and reproduction.
You want to add the Porsche example?
Okay, I learned from a guy who runs the Stuttgart Supercomputer Center, which has one of the biggest machines in Europe, and they do the crash test simulation for a German car builder, the one with the sport cars where the engine is in the back, you know what I mean. And he told me that reproducing crash tests has nothing to do with ethics. It has to do with insurance problems. If someone sues Porsche in an accident, Porsche gives the responsibility to the High Performance Computer Center who did the calculation, and they have to show the material and show that everything was right and the experiment was right in a reproducible way. And he told me, we cannot reproduce it. Or we have to keep the whole hall with the supercomputing, plus the software, plus the compilers, plus the written down random numbers, and lock it for several years if Porsche gets sued. It cannot be reproduced because there's machine learning, there's floating point operation, there are compilers that route the workload through thousands of cores of the processors. So you have to trust the crash test, but you cannot reproduce the experiment, which is an interesting thing. And it's fundamentally not reproducible. It's not about errors or sloppiness or throwing away data. So feed the machine with the data you saved and it won't show the same result.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me here. I feel very lucky to be here at Thomas Mann House, to be with my colleagues, and to be with you as we talk about something that I think is really at the center of American life. I'm an American cultural historian. I focus on media technology in American life from World War II to the present. And like my colleagues, I'm deeply concerned with architectures of trust and with the transformed meaning of computing. You know, I live and work and teach in Silicon Valley, and there we frequently hear that the internet has been responsible for the mass polarization of American life and increasingly international life. And I think what I'd like to do today is make a case that that isn't quite so, but that nevertheless, science and computing are themselves in part culpable for the culture of polarization that we have today. I'm going to tell that story as a historical story from the 40s with 3 examples that I hope will be clear and that we'll have lots of chance to talk about as we get going later today. I want to return first to the late 1940s and to the terrible fear that afflicted Americans in that time that mass media were literally turning Germans into fascists. One of the great explanations for why Hitler came to power among Americans was that he gained control of the radio, of cinema, of one-to-many media. And one of the great hopes in America, especially in the later years of the war, and then finally in 1948 when the first digital computer was made, was that we could build digital systems, distributed systems of communication, that would enable us to have a leveled, non-hierarchical, collaborative, individual-centered society. And this would in fact be a democratic society. This vision animated Norbert Wiener's work on cybernetics, which Claus has already referred to. It animated Friedrich Hayek's work in economics. The dream was that with the proper technology, we could in fact signal to one another, know one another as signaling systems, be like information systems ourselves, signal to one another who we were, what we wanted, and out of that process, political order would emerge. We would no longer need the kind of hierarchies that seem to have captured Europe. And that new order would be individual-centered, collaborative, and in that sense, democratic. That vision animates the rise of computing in the late 40s and early 50s, despite the fact that computers themselves in that period were large, room-sized machines used by centralized organizations like insurance companies. My point here, and I think this is an important one, is that media matter not just for the messages they transmit, but for the metaphors that they offer us about how we might live. So computing in that period really was a kind of metaphor for a democratic possibility that we were seeking, even as, in its big metal boxes tucked in the back rooms of insurance companies, it was a technology of centralization. Okay. Fast forward now to, let's start in 1965. And we'll go to the plains of Colorado. Now, I'm looking around the audience. I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember this. I want to talk about a commune. I want to talk about a commune called Drop City. Drop City was a commune established on the plains of Colorado in which its members lived in giant geodesic domes designed by Buckminster Fuller. And these were thought to be technologies that would help you live more in harmony with the forces of the world. Very shortly thereafter, Stuart Brand and his wife Lois went out to these communes, including Drop City, and they created a catalog, the Whole Earth Catalog. And in that catalog, to my complete surprise when I started researching it, was a copy of Norbert Wiener's book, The Human Use of Human Beings, along with his book, Cybernetics. In addition, there was a giant Hewlett-Packard calculator. And think for a second, right? If you're headed back to the land, if you're moving to a commune, what kind of tools do you really want? Do you want a giant calculator? Probably not. Do you want a copy of Cybernetics? Probably not, unless there's another principle at work. All right, so between 1967 and 1973, we had the largest wave of commune building in American history. 750,000 people went back to the land. And when they did, they were seeking to live out a cybernetic dream. They dreamed that the world was, in fact, a series of information systems that could be revealed through the use of proper technologies, whether those were cybernetic computers or another government-sponsored technology of delight, LSD. These were technologies that were thought to reveal a fundamentally informational structure to the world. Now, those of you who remember the 60s will remember that the 60s was also the heyday of a kind of expressive individualism. And this is where our story gets complicated. The children of the 60s inherited a vision of the world as an information system in which every individual signaler could connect to every other signaler and order would emerge. And in that sense, the informational vision of the world solicited the individual expression of all of us. It was our expression to one another that would become the foundation of this new democracy. Trouble is, when you actually build that world, when you actually build that system, say in Harvard at Facebook, or in California at Google, or in Amazon, whose first programmer was in fact a veteran of the Whole Earth Catalog, when you start building that world, a world of expressive individualism, it actually becomes really difficult for democratic principles to take hold and stay there. Let me see if I can get at this. What I want to argue here is that a new logic of authority, a new logic of trust has crept into our society from this period. If you go back to the communes built around shared consciousness, around intimacy, around the idea that we're all part of the same system, were terrible places to live. When you take away hierarchy, when you take away bureaucracy, what you get is rule by cool. You get, thank you for laughing back there, I appreciate that. I like that laugh, I thought that was pretty good. Yeah, it's a tough audience. But my point is that when you take away rules, what you get are norms. And the communes that I studied turned out to be ruled by the same norms as the most ruthless parts of suburbia. They were heteronormative, they were racially segregated, they were gender segregated, and it was really quite awful. Fast forward again to Facebook. What we have, I think, in the era of social media is a world that is in fact built precisely to the dreams of the figures of the 40s and early 50s. precisely to the notion that we can, with proper information technology, create a world in which everyone can talk to everyone and we no longer need authority from above. But what we don't take into account in that process is the lesson of the communes. When you try to organize in that way, what you lose is the ability to negotiate the distribution of resources across differences. You lose your faith in institutions, and you begin to institute claims to authority based on individual experience. And we see those all through our society today. We inhabit a society in which our claims to being one kind of person or another, having one belief system or another, one kind of experience or another, that's our claim to participation in the public sphere. And it's a terrible paradox. The very forces that have helped us create a more diverse, egalitarian, accepting America have also created new terms of highly individualistic, experience-driven authority that I think are helping give rise to a new kind of authoritarianism, an authoritarianism centered precisely in technology-enabled expressive individualism. I think I'll stop there. I look forward to the questions and the comments. Thank you.
So thank you, Soraya, Klaus, and Fred. We start the discussion here on the panel. I have a question. Were you talking, Klaus and Soraya, were you talking about the same thing? The trust in science is something negotiated through a community of scientists, peer-reviewed or not, and all the debate is in there. And the trust in machines is also similarly organized, except that the machines are not the ones we suppose them to be. Or the machines are not. Is your idea that the machines are not to be regulated, or they are creative in a productive way?
My impression is that, I mean, in a sense, also with parts of social media, we're closer to the 40s than to the 80s, for example. I mean, all these ideas of machine learning, they now work, but they're 1940s ideas. I mean, this. What was the second part of your question? Regulation.
I think my question is, does our trust go wrong? Is that your point? For her, trust was very important.
Yeah.
It was vital for achieving.
I wouldn't say wrong. I hand it over to you in a second. I wouldn't say it went wrong. I mean, media, every medium takes a while to culturally stabilize. And the computing history, there are these 50 years where it was stabilized at a deterministic, reliable machine. And this is the way trust works. But there may be other ideas. I mean, you're very much in the history of the book, and you know better than me that the book take 200 years or so to stabilize. Today, we imagine a book as an entity with a serial identity. There are distributed copies of this, but all copies are the same and everyone can read the same text. But over 200, I mean, Tycho Brahe is very prominent. He has his own print shop and he printed books sometimes in the edition of one, depending on the donor. And there was the pirate copies in the 17th century. So not every book was identical. Book was a completely unreliable medium. And this was a period that took much longer than the 50 years of computing. So perhaps the definition of what computing is too young to say.
I'd love to jump on that. Okay. I think that our faith in computing is rooted in our ancient faith in science. And we tend to expect of computing things that we don't expect of television or of radio or of newspapers. And I think that's led us astray. I think one of the fantasies that we have from the 40s is that if we just build a technological system that can do for us with efficiency and trustability what our political system cannot seem to do with efficiency and trustability, all will be well. And I really think that's a mistake that's haunting us at the moment.
And to come back to your question, are we talking about the same? I would say, yes, the computer was constructed, or they wanted to construct a computer in a way that it would be one of these technologies of trust, because reproducibility is, of course, one of the key characteristics of science. It needs to be reproducible. But what I missed in you saying is, so you speak 20 years ago, there was this crisis of reproducibility, and was that linked to the fact that computers started being more of this adaptation and learning kind of, or where did this crisis start? Did the computer change, or did the expectation change?
Okay. I mean, yeah, it fits in the chronology with the return of certain algorithms, learning algorithms, the return of statistics. That's why the translation systems get better at learning, and they do statistic and they do generative grammar all at once, and they get better. There was something else.
So the computers changed, and that's why we got this.
The computers changed, and I mean, yeah, but there also was the idea, because of the idea that the computer is the perfect medium for experimentation. It was used in, let's say, disciplines like psychology, medicine, which are something different than physics, for example. I mean, you see this in digital humanities, the same thing has started. I mean, there are actually projects where digital humanities scholars start to train computer systems on old humanities scholar findings. Yeah, so we know that Goethe's Wilhelm Meister is an educational novel, a Bildungsroman in German. What they're trying to do is to feed a text into a machine learning system so that the machine can identify the text as a Bildungsroman. I mean, this sounds stupid. I didn't make this up. This is digital humanities research. So what they're basically doing is reproducing outdated humanities research from the 50s and 60s to train and to validate machine learning software. Yeah, giving the promise that if we reproduce outdated findings, then the software is validated and will make new findings that are also valid and that you can trust. I mean, this is a completely stupid idea, but this is the way of transplanting computational science to research fields that aren't used or made for. I mean, it would be the other way around. It would be interesting, because humanities have a huge experience to deal with trust without reproducibility. So it's strange.
Yeah. I think there's a thing that I think that's really compelling. One piece that we're not talking about yet, though, is legitimacy. These computers can be used to give social legitimacy to projects that might not otherwise have it. Why would the humanities suddenly embrace this self-evidently inane project? One reason is that if you're a humanist, and I speak with deep experience here, if you're a humanist at an institution where millions and millions of dollars are flowing in for STEM-oriented development, and in which you, as a professor, can pick up $20,000, $40,000 in grant money like that if you just say computational. But if you say, what I really want to do is do a really beautiful close reading of that novel, yeah, good luck with that. My point here is that science and computation are not only things in themselves that have trust issues within themselves, that they are that. They are also ported into public discourse as metaphors, as techniques, as ways of legitimating some communities over others. They are deeply political, and we need a kind of political way of thinking about them.
So we are talking about the machines, but it seems like we should also maybe talking about the money. And I don't know, because you speak about the becoming a consumer good, right? And you just also spoke about the money. And so the machines live in capitalist system or something, and I don't know.
I love that you're giving me the microphone to speak about the money.
From Stanford.
Yeah. I don't know what to say about the money. I do think the money is a distorting force. I have one thought about the money that might be useful. So my first intellectual affection, what made me a scholar, was that I fell in love with the writings of the American Puritans. These are the Pilgrims who came over in 1620 and other folks around them. And they believed in an idea that I think haunts Silicon Valley today. It was the idea of predestination, that God had decided that some folks were going to heaven and some folks were not. And the folks who were going to heaven were likely to do better on this earth because, heck, God wouldn't take to heaven people he wouldn't support here on earth. Through that line of thinking, in America generally, but especially in the Massachusetts area and now the California area, came the notion that wealth was a sign of having been chosen, of being a special person. And you see that all through Silicon Valley. You see that in how we celebrate people who make a tremendous amount of money. Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, and on down the pike. My point here is that money is a sign in American culture of something much deeper, of something almost holy. And in part for that reason, it's much harder to challenge than it might otherwise be.
I would like to come back to the word trust and to the arguments you put forward, which to me seem all to criticize blind trust. You quoted this guy who is against the peer review system. But I think having a criticism like this is a very good sign of a functioning system, because trust cannot live without some question and some checking. I come from the library world, and the library is in general trusted. But not every book in the library is trusted the same way. So people they exercise critical judgment. And so that the world of trust, even in my own head, is very diverse. I mean, sometimes I trust directly, implicitly, it's an institution. Sometimes I exercise my right to not trust right away, a little later. There's mechanisms of control. And wouldn't you say that the one you quoted is still arguing within the system, because he wants to build a better system, or is there actually an alternative to a peer-reviewed system?
The person I was quoting was Feynman, the mathematician. He thought, I think he had problems with the delegation of considering if this was good or bad science or whatever, right? It's so the delegation, and so since they do it, the peer reviewers, we don't need to do it, right? And so that he was criticizing.
I have a last question to you, Fred. When you were criticizing or describing these communities, you were implicitly saying there is a lack of institution and a lack, hence, of trust in institution. And is that irredeemable?
This is such an important question. I studied the communes because I wanted to get a glimpse of what I hoped would be a better world, a world more centered on individual people, on emotional and intellectual intimacy. And what I found was a world where, as one woman said to me, the men go to the big room and talk about important things, and we go to the back and put bleach in the water so nobody gets sick. These worlds were enormously chaotic, and they looked to me like a microcosm of what America might become if we lose faith in our institutions. Institutions are what make it possible not to live with other people who are already like you, but to negotiate with people who are fundamentally not like you. They're what make it possible. Rules are what make it possible for you to agree even when you disagree at the most fundamental levels. Finally, depersonalizing debate is absolutely critical. The communes were enormously personalized environments. I was always myself, you were always yourself. My job was to be as authentic as possible. Your job was to be your authentic self with me. That's actually a really terrible way to do a lot of the things that societies need to do. Imagine going to the bank and having to present your whole self to the person behind the counter. But that's the kind of pressure, I have a 27-year-old daughter. That's the kind of pressure she lives under. She and her friends are on Instagram. She and her friends are on Facebook. She and her friends are on TikTok. And they are constantly signaling, presenting all of the wholeness of their being. And that's an awful way to live. We need some shelter. And that shelter is institutional. We need rules. We need, dare I say it, bureaucracy.
Thank you very much. Here on the panel, you in the audience, we may now get out of the shade and you may get out of the sun.
Come drink with us, yeah.